Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about the Lend-Lease Act, arguably one of the most iconic military support decisions, for lack of a better word, ever made, as then President FDR wanted to provide financial and military aid to Allied powers in the build-up to and early stages of the Second World War. He would have to navigate his way around a strong isolationist trend among both Congress and the US population. Now, at the very least, I do understand isolationists and isolationism, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. When it comes to foreign conflicts, there's this level of detachment that makes it easier to just brush it off. It doesn't directly involve you, so why get involved? Now, in today's world, because of a litany of reasons, a major conflict impacts far more than just the countries that are directly involved, but that's a different discussion for a different day. Instead, let's focus back on the Second World War, in the extended wake of American participation in World War I, and not being too far removed from a major global financial crisis. Many in America were none too keen on potentially throwing themselves into another global fray. In 1938, the vast majority of Americans thought that participating in the First World War was a mistake. Shortly after the start of World War II, a poll done in January 1940 found that 88% of Americans opposed joining the war, and by June, only 35% supported helping the British. As 1940 progressed, and Britain saw significant attacks on their homeland proper, American support for joining the war effort would increase, but there was still a strong isolationist trend in the country, with groups like the America First Committee promoting isolationism, and seeing a total membership nearly 1 million strong. Going up against groups like these and just general public and political opposition, FDR would have a very difficult time drumming up support for sending arms abroad. Congress would pass these so-called Neutrality Acts in the mid to late 30s that outlined America's neutral stance on the world stage. FDR was opposed to these acts broadly, but he would start to make dents in American neutrality starting in the 1937 Neutrality Act, as that act would allow for the cash and carry sale of non-war material, and by November 1939, FDR managed to make a major crack in American isolationism, and arms sales through cash and carry were allowed. Then, by March 1941, American isolationism was basically shattered through the implementation of the Lend-Lease Act, that granted FDR and America broadly the ability to provide war materials, few, if any, strings attached to the Allied powers. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the full name, an act to promote the defense of the United States ended up providing, I believe the proper term is a buttload of weapons and vehicles and various whatnots. Over $50 billion worth in World War II era money, or almost $700 billion worth in today's money. More than half of that went to the British, and about 1/5 of that went over to the Soviet Union. And it's the Soviet side that I want to focus more on today, and even more specifically, one small line of aircraft that didn't see that much use, if really any, over in America as an American aircraft, but far more use over in Eastern Europe with the Soviet Union, serving as a major Lend-Lease aircraft to the Soviets. This is the Bell P-63 Kingcobra, along with the Bell P-39 Airacobra, as the story of the P-63 would be just about empty without the P-39. So, to start, we'll go back to pre-World War II, back between 1936 and 1938, with a young Bell Aircraft Corporation looking to make a name for itself in the aircraft production market. When you're a young, new, fresh aircraft company looking to make inroads and start receiving contracts, there are multiple ways to go about it. You can go the boring route by making decent, run-of-the-mill planes that don't really do anything new or exciting, but fill in gaps and take up space. Basically, you can make like training aircraft and whatnot. Then you could go the teamwork route by taking contracts for other companies to produce their designs, to produce the designs that are already accepted and just aid in the overall war effort. Or you can take the more entertaining route and design something unique, something that really stands out and turns heads. For Bell's first design, the YFM-1 Airacuda, they would go with that entertaining route and design a twin-engine pusher-prop heavy fighter and interceptor that looked far more like a tiny blimp with two baby blimps in the wings. Now, while certainly unique and interesting looking, the Airacuda was plagued with issues that reduced its overall performance and doomed it to failure. But regardless of its failure, this didn't stop Bell from trying to do something different and innovative. For their next act, they would design a more traditional single-engine fighter with your typical tractor-style propeller, but basic appearances can be deceiving. And this new fighter design from Bell would actually be one of the more unique and bold ones seen in America in the pre-war period, or at the very least one of the more unique that ended up being pretty successful. The central aspect of this new design, both figuratively and literally, would be a pretty run-of-the-mill engine in the Allison V-1710. Now, on most single-engine planes of this era, the engine is located right at the nose, right behind the propeller. This isn't done because it's the best possible location for the engine, but rather because it's the easiest and it's the most practical. Having the engine right in the nose makes it easy to connect the propeller to the engine. No need for any kind of complex extension on the drive shaft or anything of that nature. Just sitting in the nose, the engine can connect right to the propeller in front of it. Having the engine right here also generally makes it easier to maintain, and it being right in the front makes cooling easier, especially if it's a radial engine. However, having the engine in the nose adds a lot of weight to the front of the plane, necessitating some counterbalancing weight to the rear. And with more weight than being at the nose and rear, this can reduce the overall maneuverability of the design. The more optimal location, then, would be right at the very center of the plane. But this too has its issues, with there being greater challenges with engine cooling and connecting the engine to the propeller. An extended drive shaft does fix that issue, but it also adds another potential failure point that on a military aircraft is less than optimal. Still though, Bell was undeterred and would place the Allison V-1710 at the very center of their new design. Also adding to the uniqueness of the design was the fact that it had tricycle landing gear, very much not common for planes of this era. While also more complex than your typical landing gear setup, the tricycle gear would ideally give the pilot greater vision while on the ground, along with greater control. Third, and lastly, the Bell design would be one of, if not the first, American single-engine fighter armed with a cannon, instead of just machine guns. And in the place of the engine in the nose, a 37mm cannon would be found, giving their design some incredible firepower. Bell would present this design to the U.S. Army in late 1937, and by October 7, 1937, the Army would place an order for a prototype of Bell's so-called Airacobra, given the designation of XP-39, measuring in at 9.19 meters long, 10.36 meters wide and 3.78 meters tall, the XP-39 looks like your typical low-wing monoplane with a standard tail setup. The general fuselage shape was a little more bulbous towards the middle due to the centrally located engine, making it look more like a fish, like a neon tetra. In addition to the centrally firing 37mm cannon, the XP-39 was to be outfitted with at least 2 additional guns, 2 50 cal machine guns in the nose, and there would also likely be some room underneath for a few 100 pounds of explosives if wanted. The cockpit, sitting just above the wings, had a bubble-style canopy that would offer excellent vision all around. Interestingly, instead of the canopy being hinged or sliding so the pilot could get in, the pilot entered through a door to the side. This wasn't terribly innovative or impressive or anything, but it was still an interesting choice regardless. Sitting behind the pilot and cockpit would be the engine, the Allison V1710 with 1150 horsepower and a General Electric B5 turbo supercharger that would ideally boost performance both at low and high altitudes. Making the design look quite slim, the air intakes for engine and supercharger cooling were tucked neatly into the side and wing roots. By April 6, 1938, Bell would complete their first prototype, and it took to the air for the first time. Initially having no armament or armor installed, thus making it quite light, at just 5,550 pounds, the performance of the first XP-39 was excellent, hitting a top speed of 390 miles an hour at an altitude of around 20,000 feet, and it would reach this altitude in just 5 minutes. This performance was good enough that at the end of April, the Army ordered 12 more aircraft to be designated the YP-39A. However, this order would come with some requested design changes, most of them beneficial, and one in particular that was very detrimental. The beneficial changes largely involved aerodynamic improvements, shortening the cockpit canopy, moving the radiators around a bit, things of that nature. These modifications all helped to improve the aerodynamics of the Airacobra, but in conjunction with these potential performance-boosting modifications, they would also request that the turbo supercharger be removed, significantly reducing potential high-altitude performance as a result. Now, the exact reason that this was done is a little bit fuzzy. It was possibly due to some financial issues, possibly due to aerodynamic reasons, but the most sensible reason that I saw mentioned was that due to America's geographic location, they wouldn't be vulnerable to mass high-altitude bombing attacks, so instead they could focus more on low-altitude maneuverability and low-altitude performance overall. Because of the removal of the turbo supercharger, along with the addition of a full armament outfit in one 37mm cannon, 2 50 cal machine guns, and 2 30 cal machine guns, along with the addition of armor, the top speed at higher altitudes dropped down to just 368 miles an hour. However, the low-altitude performance was basically the exact same, and because of that, the Army was perfectly fine with the performance of the Airacobra, and so an initial order of 80 Airacobras was to be placed, and these initial model Airacobras were designated the P-39C. However, with this order and eventual deliveries of the P-39C, with World War II and specifically the Western theater of the war beginning in honest, Allied combat experience against Axis fighter aircraft revealed to the Army that even without flying it in combat yet, the P-39C would be outclassed against German fighters, thus necessitating at least the addition of some more armor and 2 more 30 cal machine guns in a new model called the P-39D. Still though, these improvements, and many, many, many more throughout the war, just did not make the P-39 a viable aircraft for the US Army Air Force. It just wasn't better than some of their other options. And aside from a small handful of units, the P-39 didn't serve in the American military. But with a total production run nearing 10,000, the P-39 was nonetheless a very successful plane, being a significant player in the Lend-Lease program and in overseas sales in general. The British were one of the first buyers of the P-39, and after seeing some of the projected specifications of the XP-39, and Bell estimating a top speed above 400 miles an hour, they placed an order for 675 of them. But when Britain received their first aircraft in mid-1941, they were thoroughly disappointed with the poor high-altitude performance and much lower top speed. And of the 675 they ordered, most of them went back to American forces in one form or another. Some 200 going back to America proper, some 200 being passed over to American forces stationed in England. Another 200, though, would go over to the P-39's biggest user and biggest fan in the Soviet Union. Now, it's not as if the P-39 over in the Soviet Union had better specs or anything of that nature. It was still primarily a low-altitude plane and did not perform well at high altitudes. And yet, over in the East, the P-39 performed far better than it did in the West, with around 5,000 P-39s being sent over to the Soviets throughout the war, serving very well against German forces of all kind. So why though? Why were the Soviets able to essentially unlock the P-39 when its creating country could not? The answer lay not in the men using it, but rather the battlefield itself, and the overall geography of Eastern Europe. Over in Western Europe, the battlefield was a lot more compact. The overall landmass was relatively small. This, combined with the prevalence of larger cities and larger industrial hubs, made larger, more destructive strategic bombers have a lot more value. However, over on the Eastern Front, things were a lot more spread out, and while Western Russia on the Eastern Front was far and away the more densely populated area of Russia, the total landmass was still substantial. So-called European Russia, not including modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, spans over 1.5 million square miles. To compare, France, in total, is just around 250,000 square miles. European Russia, to put it mildly, is absolutely massive, and the far more spread out cities, combined with a lot of battles there taking place in large, more open and rural areas, meant that these massive, high-altitude strategic bombers just had less value. There was also the fact that Eastern Europe was far more underdeveloped and muddy, and just not conducive to larger aircraft, and overall small dive bombers and low-altitude attack aircraft ended up reigning supreme on the Eastern Front. Planes that could strafe ground troops, attack small targets, and just generally offer support were far better, thus making low-altitude attackers like the P-39 a very useful aircraft. As a result, and due to the Soviets being the primary user of the P-39, when Bell went about making a potential successor to it, if America did not want the successor, the Soviets would be first in line to receive it, and they would likely welcome it with open arms. This improved model began to form in mid-1941, when Bell was trying to improve upon the P-39, and in their attempts to improve performance, they proposed two designs to be tested: the XP-39E, and the XP-63. The XP-39E was basically just a P-39, but with laminar flow wings, a taller tail, and a slightly stronger engine. This design was rather short-lived though, and did not represent a serious upgrade to any existing P-39 models. The XP-63, on the other hand, showed quite a lot more promise, measuring in at 9.96 meters long, 11.68 meters wide, and 3.84 meters tall. The XP-63 design was an all-around larger P-39. Also to be powered by an Allison V1710, the XP-63 differed from the P-39 with the addition of an Allison-made supercharger to boost overall performance. The XP-63 would share the laminar flow wing and larger tail of the XP-39E in an effort to boost performance. And to help make maintenance easier for the ground crew, the cowling around the nose was altered to make access easier to the guns inside. Armed with a 37mm cannon firing centrally, and 4 total 50 cal machine guns, 2 in the nose and 2 under wing, the XP-63 was well armed, and under each wing and under fuselage was room for a 500-pound bomb each, for a total max bomb load of 1,500 pounds. First flying on December 7, 1942, the initial flights of the XP-63 were a little rocky, but promising. They were promising because it eventually managed a top speed of 426 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, the laminar flow wing and additional supercharger clearly making a difference. But at the same time, they were a bit rocky due to the fact that the first 2 prototypes crashed, one due to a landing gear failure and one due to an engine failure. Nonetheless, and even before the first flight of the XP-63, the Army Air Force approved it for production back in September 1942, and by October 1943, the P-63 Kingcobra started to be delivered to the Army Air Force for further testing, training, and hopefully combat use. But by that time, other American fighters like the P-47, P-38, etc. already had a very firm hold in the Army Air Force, and the performance of the P-63 was not viewed as being superior to any of them. Now, it did actually have a greater roll rate than any of them, but other than that, there wasn't much of a point in US forces fielding the P-63. It wasn't a bad plane by any stretch of the imagination, but there were just better and more battle-tested planes available. This would mean that the Soviet Union was right in line to start receiving the P-63 through Lend-Lease, and of the 3,300 or so produced P-63s, around 2,500 of them went to the Soviets, and a decent number would go to the French as well. Now, allegedly, and I say allegedly because aside from an unsourced sentence on Wikipedia, I couldn't actually find any more details on this, a 1943 agreement between America and the Soviets said that the P-63s the Soviets received were to be exclusively held in the East for an eventual attack on Japan. Again, I couldn't actually find anything on this supposed P-63 agreement, but I felt it was worth mentioning anyway. But regardless, even if this agreement was real, what would actually prevent the Soviets from using it against German forces? In all likelihood, they absolutely did use them against Germany, and allegedly Germany saw them and took some of them out, although these easily could have just been P-39s mistaken for P-63s. But anyway, semantics aside, specific details of the P-63 in combat with the Soviets is a little sparse, but more likely than not, the P-63 served as an excellent complement to the existing P-39s and would serve quite well as a low-altitude supporting fighter. Before we end, there is one final role for the P-63 I want to mention, because it had a rather interesting post-war role. America still had a decent number of P-63s at their disposal, and with better prop planes in their arsenal and jet fighters coming into prominence, a number of these P-63s were converted into so-called pinball planes. These aircraft were painted a bright reddish orange, and were fit with increased armor, bulletproof glass, and sensors. They would then be flown for some target practice, to be used as the target. To make them reusable, the attacking plane would use frangible rounds, or rounds that just disintegrate on impact. When these rounds made contact with the pinball P-63, the sensors installed would detect the impact and illuminate a small light, signaling to the attacking plane that it was a successful hit. Past this rather interesting usage, though, the P-63 would see some limited post-war use for the Soviets and French, but ultimately it did very little post-World War II. So ultimately, I think the P-39 P-63 combo fun package shows that the best role, the best use for a given plane may not be immediately apparent. For planes that may be considered inferior, that may be seen as having little value to some, they may have considerable value to others. Take something like the Brewster Buffalo, often regarded as one of the worst planes of World War II. While most Allied forces didn't like it, Finland really liked it, and had considerable success with it, going so far as to attempt to make their own copy of it. And for the P-39 and P-63, while not remotely as maligned as the Buffalo, it wasn't wanted by the Americans or the British, but found its specific role and specific place over in Eastern Europe. Ultimately, it's like the P-39, and P-63 is a coming-of-age story, planes finding their place in the world, and their place just so happened to be taking down some Nazis. What a place to find. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Circling back to the P-39 looking like a neon tetra, I really love neon tetras. They're a pretty basic and common fish, sure, but they really add some vibrancy to a tank. Like you have a tank filled with live plants, and a school of neons. That's always a really nice looking aquarium. It's a nice contrast between the green of the plants and that bright blue and red of the neons. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and this small chat about fish, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.